Bene.
Good evening to you all, and welcome. Welcome to this meeting. This meeting is just a continuation of the meeting that we had beforehand. And we tried to make an in-depth analysis. So we're going to continue the dialogue that we started with Professor Philip Jenkins. Let's give a round of applause to Professor Philip. For those of you who were not there at the meeting earlier, Professor Jenkins is a historian of Baylor University in Texas. He works for different magazines, Catholic and non-Catholic magazines, and certainly is the most important demographer of religions. He studies the demography of religions, which is a very interesting topic, because it enables us to understand and interpret some fundamental aspects of this radical change of era, which we cannot fully grasp. We cannot fully grasp its trends, the direction. Professor Jenkins studies facts, telling us the future map of the world, how the world will be like in the future, not by reading a crystal ball, but by using facts, reality, figures. And reality tells us that the world is changing quite significantly, and also the physiognomy, the structure of religion is changing, and in particular, Christianity is radically changing today. Maybe someone of you has already heard these figures if you were at the meeting beforehand earlier. Just to give you an idea, here we're talking about a world where in very few years, 2030 or 2050, the structure of religion will be totally different. According to data, facts, and numbers, in 2030, there will be more Catholics in Africa than in Europe. In very few years, in 2050, the continent where Christianity was born will be Africa. 1 billion Christians in Africa. In China, in very few years, there will be more Christians than in Italy. In 2030, correct me if I'm wrong, Professor, in the top 10 countries with the largest number of Christians, there will not be the most important European countries. So this world is radically changing very fast. And this is already happening today. We're not talking about the future. We're talking about today, something which is underway, which is giving a different structure to Christianity. So now we have the possibility to continue the dialogue with Professor Jenkins. I will break the ice by asking him questions, but then you can also have a Q&A session with him. So we have the possibility to talk to him in order to understand how Christianity will be like in the future, in a future which is very nearby. Now, let's start with the first question. Can you please give us a very short map of the situation? How will the situation be like in 2050? 2050 means like tomorrow.
If you look at a map of the largest Christian countries, then you're talking about the United States, Brazil and Mexico. You're speaking of African countries like Nigeria, the Congo, and Ethiopia. Asian countries like China and the Philippines. What are the countries that are not mentioned here? Countries like Britain and France and Italy and Germany. And that's particularly true in the Catholic world. So for instance, last year there were more Roman Catholic baptisms in the Philippines than in France and Spain and Italy and Poland combined. So that is a church that is moving to the South, it is no longer a church that is identified with Euro-American civilization. It is a global church with many new Christians, people who are Christians often for the first or the second generation. So it is a young church for young people and young cultures. Of course, this means that it does not mean that Christianity will disappear in old and Western countries, but it means a new world. People sometimes talk about the captivity of the church. And there are some people who would argue that for the last 500 years, the church has been in a kind of captivity in the North Atlantic world. Now that captivity has ended, and Christianity is back to what it was always meant to be, a truly worldwide, global church. And that is a complete rewriting of our history and our future. And as was just said, this is not some far distant future. The change has happened in my lifetime, and it will happen even faster in your lifetimes. You live in one of the most exciting times in Christian history. You are very lucky people.
Ecco, perché questo
But why this change leading to a different church, which is different compared to what we really imagine, what we usually imagine? In Europe, we talk about an aging church, which is getting tired. But now here we're talking about a young church, a younger church, which is alive, which is dynamic, which renovates. And from a historical point of view, a church going back home where it was born originally. The church was born in Asia. Let's not forget about that. This change is moving us and is frightening us. We're afraid of that. Why? Why is that, in your opinion?
Question of why we are afraid, that's a different question. A large part of it is where populations are growing. And let me simplify it. Back in 1900, there were 3 Europeans alive for every African. By 2050, there will be 3 Africans alive for every European. Europe's population is very stable. Africa's population has grown enormously. In 1900, there were probably about 100 million people on the continent. By 2050, there will be over 2 billion. As Christians made up a share of that, as the overall numbers grew, so Christians grew. But there is also another very important factor, which is conversions. Back in 1900, perhaps 10% of African people were Christian. Today, the number is around 50%. So during the century, about 40% of Africa's people moved from paganism to Christianity. It is the greatest success story in the history of missions. And so few people actually recognize it. So we're talking about many different kinds of change and expansion, and not just in Africa. There are amazing changes in China, for example. In China, there were probably 5 million Christians in 1950. When shortly after the communists took power, everyone thought that communism would destroy Christianity. And then today, we've gone from 5 million to 75 million. As communism failed in the 1970s and 80s, as the ideology failed, so people looked for a new ideology to explain the world, to give them progress and peace and human rights. And a great many of them accepted Christianity, which is why Christianity is growing so widely among all sorts of people. Among ordinary people, among peasants, among workers, but also among artists and intellectuals. So that is, again, one of the most important expansions in history. How much will that grow? I don't know. And I would only argue with one thing, which is already there are more Christians in China than in Italy, and there will be ever more.
Yes. But what is the challenge posed to us Western Christians? Because we in the West are used to identify ourselves with Christianity as it used to be. What is the change that is needed from us in the West in terms of mindset?
I think there are a couple of things. One of the most important is to recognize history is not just to write the history of Christianity solely in terms of the West. We have to think of where Christians were 1,000 years ago. If you look at a map of Christianity 1,000 years ago, there were great churches back then in India and China and so on, great churches in Africa. When we study the history of Christianity, we should do it in a rounded, global way. We should remember, what is the first country in the world to accept Christianity? It's not the Roman Empire. It might be Armenia, it might be Ethiopia, but it's either an Asian country or an African country. Sometimes people will say Christianity has no place in Asia or in Africa. It's a European colonialist, imperialist religion. Please remember, there were Christians in Tibet before there were Buddhists in Tibet. Christianity has very deep Asian roots, but it was a Christianity that completely accepted the world in which it operated. So its symbol 1,000 years ago was the cross and the flower of the lotus. It was a holy Asian Christianity. What I'm saying is, we could talk at great length about what that history is, but if we just write a history of Christianity, or we read a history of Christianity that is just about Catholics and Protestants, and maybe Orthodox, we are only telling a very small part of the story. When we see a map of Christianity that is just Europe and the Mediterranean, that map unconsciously is lying. It is telling a falsehood. If you want to see a map of Christian history, look at a map of Europe and Asia and Africa. Christians have a terrible problem. They are understating, underclaiming their past. And what they have to do is rediscover a world that their spiritual ancestors knew. It was their world. It was a Christian place to wander and convert and carry out mission.
Yes, this is what I wanted to ask you exactly. What can we learn? What can we learn from this fact, from this history, and from these new churches and new Christianity coming by? What is the new Christianity teaching us? This is the question.
Well, the first thing is that just because a religion is very successful in Africa, say, or it has particular forms and structures, it does not mean that people around the world have to accept every one of those. Of course not. Different structures will work in different societies. We have to recognize a very wide diversity of structures. Different things will work in different parts of the world. That is one thing. But also we can learn some things from these new churches, from their main central interests, many ideas that were common in the earliest church, but which have since faded. So, for instance, if you go to a church in Africa or India, you will find that church will always be interested in offering healing. Healing of the body, of the mind, of the spirit, and of society. And that language of healing is very much what you might have found in the world of the New Testament. I'm not saying that these people have a mystical connection with the New Testament, but these are similar societies. So they have a focus on healing, and it must perhaps make us ask a question: have Western churches entirely given up the whole world of healing to secular doctors, secular therapists? How much can Western churches rediscover an idea of the healing of soul and spirit? To think of another area, for many, many years, Christians in the West have lived in a world where there was really only one main religion that they had to deal with. Most people were Christian. There were Jewish minorities, and the experience of maltreatment of those minorities was often terrible. But today we live in a world where Christians and Muslims and Hindus have to learn to live together, not in a world where there is any one government of a particular faith. How does that affect how we live? We can learn a lot about this from history. We know that 1,000 years ago, Christians lived in Asia, where there might be a Christian monastery here and a Buddhist monastery a kilometer away, and a Manichaean monastery here. Somehow they had these close relations. They learned to live together. We have a great set of precedents of history from which we can learn. What we are doing today when we try and form relations with other religions, as the phrase goes, we are reinventing the wheel. We are trying to discover the wheel again. There is a great history from which we can learn. But if there is, as I say, a single thing that we really need to learn from newer churches, it's this idea of healing, of the power of the Spirit, something that is well known in some ways in Western churches, but that has to be at the front of the agenda.
There's another aspect which really strikes me thinking about the young churches in other countries. They have a lot of problems. They live in a lot of difficulties. They are persecuted. Sometimes there are many martyrs in those young churches. Now, to us, Western Christians, now, if we think about the word persecution, martyr, we think about something very far away in the past. Now, we see many other things recalling us, those martyrs of the past. But to us, a martyr is something connected to the early Christianity. For many local churches, new churches, talking about martyrs means talking about current events, something happening just a few years ago or events underway. What does that show? Because I think that we can learn a lot from that.
Right. Martyrdom, of course, has always been a central theme of Christian history. There have been some ages when it has gone away, but martyrdom, in a sense, is a normal part, a normal expectation of Christian history. Sometimes we think of this in terms of the conflict with Islam, and of course that has been a situation. But many of the bloodiest instances of martyrdom have happened with other religions, especially with Buddhists, and also with secular regimes. By far the bloodiest martyrdoms have occurred at the hands of, for instance, the Soviet communists, the Chinese communists. There are very few competitors to the Soviets. We almost have forgotten so many of these instances. In Korea, in Vietnam, in the 19th century, in the 1860s and 1870s, literally hundreds of thousands of Christians, and especially Catholics, were martyred. The main reason we do not see these martyrdoms is that we have failed to pay attention. These must happen in this strange part of the world which has nothing to do with us. We live in this world. And one of the most alarming things, of course, is on some occasions, martyrdom can be so successful that it can wholly uproot and destroy churches, as has almost happened in Iraq, as happened in some parts of Syria. And that must raise some very powerful, very disturbing questions of theology. How can we explain this? How can we understand what God means in permitting this? And we can explore this, we can come up with answers, but this is something that our theology needs to pay attention to. When we take our theology and expand it to a global scale, we start seeing many other questions that we would not see otherwise, and we will have to pay attention to in years to come. A global church needs a global history. A global church needs a global theology. And perhaps there are some mysteries there that we still have to address and consider. So in so many ways, I am trying to tell a story that is optimistic, that is a story of many successes and much growth. But it also, as has been said, has many challenges for us. It is not just that Christianity is no longer Western. A global church must address different questions and different dilemmas.
There's an aspect in the re-globalization of the church which is very clear to us all. For the first time, there's a pope coming from a country which is not one of the typical Western countries. We have a Latin American pope for the first time. It's a pope inviting us to look at the world from the peripheries, from the suburbs. He uses words and gestures which are very strong. What does that indicate to us? What does that suggest us? Is that a sign of a change which is underway? And what do we have to do? How do we have to interpret reality? How do we have to change?
You know, I live in the United States, where the Catholic Church has always been very strong. There are some predictions that by 2050, perhaps 80 or 90% of active Catholics will be either Latin American or Asian. And the older Catholic populations will be such a small minority. Many people will be very uncomfortable about that. But that is a a normal change in Christian history. In some ways, we are going back to the experience of the early church, when for the first few centuries the church was Greek before it was Latin, even in Italy. In the 7th and 8th century, there were popes from Greece. There were many figures from North Africa. There were Syrian popes. So much of what we know in the Mass was introduced by those Greek and Syrian popes. So I like to say that in some ways our churches are returning to normality. That is not just a European normality. The Pope is, of course, asking many powerful questions about the periphery, and this is the first wave. I don't know exactly, but I'm sure that in decades to come there will be more and more popes from Asia and especially Africa. In 30 or 40 years, the bulk of the world's Catholics, majority, will live in Africa. What does that mean in terms of the theology, the theological questions that they will ask? Will they be asking questions, for example, about the importance of healing? How differently will they regard the relationship with other religions, especially Islam? These will be interesting questions for the European Catholics of the future. And please remember one thing. When we talk about the European Catholics of 2050, many of those European Catholics will have African or Asian roots. Sometimes if I go to a pilgrimage church in Great Britain, everyone there is British, but often their ancestors are from Africa or the Caribbean. So the church is a church of a different color, and it is very natural that the Vatican and the popes will represent that. For me, a period of great change, great growth is a very fine thing. It can raise troubling questions, but it is much, much better to live in an expanding, challenging church than in a church that is quiet and failing and aging and nobody asks any questions. There is an Arabic proverb which is that a house with children is like a bazaar. It is a crazy marketplace. It is noisy. A church without, a house without children is like a graveyard. I would rather live in the bazaar with the noise and the questions.
Mi sembra una...
Well, this is a very interesting challenge and perspective. So now I would like to give the floor to the audience. If anybody is interested in going into more details in any of the points that have been raised, if there is a microphone for the audience, if there is no microphone for the audience, I can lend you mine. So please come close to the stage so I can give you the microphone more easily. I am Christian because I like being happy. I adhere to this religion because it corresponds to my idea of happiness. I don't know if this corresponds to the healing of the soul, but to me that's the wish for happiness. The fact that the Christians of tomorrow, in the future, there's this prospect of having in Africa and in Latin America, of having more Christians and in percentage terms, fewer Christians in the Western world. Do you think that this means that we are losing out in the Western world? We are losing out on the sense of true life that bring us to look for happiness?
It's very important. Please understand that when I say that Christianity is declining in relative terms in Europe or North America, I don't mean it is dying out, it is fading or failing. There are so many people who will find that happiness. but it is just that the numbers are shifting. Numbers are not everything, but they are not nothing. And the other question is the kinds of Christianity that they will find. It might be that I have not talked much about technology, about the changes in technology, how they will affect the way that people act together, communicate together, how they remember things together, how they find happiness together. And it might well be that in Europe and North America, people will build on these skills, learn to use them with responsibility. My only point is that the numbers will be smaller. And the good news for people seeking happiness in Christianity is they have so many other models to draw on, so many different ideas that they can use, they can follow where they are appropriate for them. So, as I say, Christianity is really moving back to a state that it has had certainly in the past. It is more diverse and in some ways perhaps more fertile, and ready to respond to a very different world.
I have a question on the contribution that we Europeans are called to give to these young churches. I travel a lot in the Middle East and in Africa, and I've seen these churches very closely. They are nice in the terms of numbers, of occasions, but it is not very evident sometimes that they are poor in terms of cultural development, in terms of thinking. So they are striving there and they're asking for help continuously. They ask for missionaries to be there, theologians. They send people to study in Europe. So how do you think we should contribute to these churches, new churches?
You raise a very important dilemma, which, if you think about it, you can bring leaders from these churches to study in Europe or North America, but what can happen is sometimes those figures become so established in Europe or North America that they do not go back, that we are, in a sense, stealing them from the churches where they can most contribute. It is often shocking when you look at some of these churches and the resources they have, even something as basic as a study edition of a Bible is like a great treasure. I know of some organizations in West Africa, for example, that have tried to offer really basic theological education to a wide variety of independent churches, regardless of theology, regardless of denomination. And they have received such a powerful response. Often those churches have drawn closer to more of an orthodox mainstream. So it becomes a question of performing an inventory. What do we have that might be of use? If you go there and say, we have come to bring you the gospel, they might well say, you are too late, we have this. So what does Europe have? So much in terms of education, of soft power, of technology, and I would add the other crucial thing, which is such a powerful draw for new churches, is in terms of health and medicine. And this kind of care, this kind of expertise that wins so many hearts, so many minds, so many souls. That is not ruling out spiritual healing in any sense, but it is bringing the best of the European world, the North American world. And if there is a biblical verse which represents this, there is a wonderful moment in the book of Acts where Paul receives the first call to travel to Europe, to cross over to Europe. And what the voice says is very important. It is, come on over and help us. Not come on over and rule us. Come and help us. What do Europeans have? What do North Americans have? We need to think very hard to do an inventory and at the same time make it a process that works both ways. We are here to learn. We are here to teach. That would be my suggestion. Come over and help us.
You have mentioned technology and human contributions, but I believe that it is the spirit that generated the church and the Acts of the Apostles. We see brotherhood and mutual help and being a community, but respecting the person and their creative skills and collaborative skills, even when mistakes are made. So, in my view, globalization should go beyond the experience of brotherhood and try to fill the divisions, the gaps in languages, in the economies, and in the technology. Thank you.
My only comment on your wise words is that where does the Spirit act? The Spirit acts through the hands of people, through the minds of people, and through the technology that a civilization and a culture develops. It does not mean that the technology of itself drives the church. It is the means by which the Spirit drives the church. Every great movement in religion corresponds with a shift of technology and media and understanding. When Christianity grew in the first few centuries, it grew by using a new form of book in the Codex, an easier way for people to transmit information and remember. Other revolutions happened in the 16th century with printing, which produced the Protestant Reformation, but also one of the greatest ages of Catholic spiritual growth, Catholic mission. And today, if used with responsibility, the Spirit has new tools or weapons in the form of the new technologies that allow churches to speak to each other, to speak peace to each other, to share knowledge across the world. And I would use the example of some African churches I know that will have services in some countries which are broadcast through satellite television, through cable, through computers to 20 or 30 different countries in a way that would have been impossible. It makes global churches, Catholic churches, possible in a way that they were not there before. So, like I say, it is an absolute obligation to come to terms with the opportunities that are raised by new technology, by new social media, because if the church does not, I can guarantee that the secular world will use them and use them very badly.
Good evening. We don't have much time left, so maybe we can collect the last 3-4 words, so please be brief. Good evening. This afternoon, you said that the countries with a strong Catholic tradition, such as Austria, Spain, and Ireland, the decrease of the church has been very strong, whereas it has been milder in France and in Italy. Is this due to the fact that in France and in Italy the church has had to strive to survive, whereas in other countries life was much more comfortable for the church?
Referring to a particular set of surveys which just trace the fate of religion, and it was rather selective according to the countries they could choose. So, for instance, Great Britain is becoming a very secular country. It was not on the list because it did not give the best kind of data that could be used. But there is a strong theory which says that religious competition is a very good way of promoting a healthy church. A church that exists as a monopoly perhaps becomes lazy and comes to accept that it will live in this way forever. So you might be correct about that.
My question is a question you will probably like. Won't we need a lot of Pentecost in this new church? What does that mean, for example, maintaining the unity of a dogmatic tradition that is thought of in Western terms and in terms of the Enlightenment period and post-Enlightenment period? What does that, how does that relate with a Christianity of the south of the world, which did not have that contact with modernity that Western Christianity had? And what about ethical issues? What does all this mean? That is, the themes that Western churches feel as ethically fundamental, as very different from the themes, the issues that are considered ethically fundamental in Latin American churches, for example. This is a sort of provocation that I wanted to share.
It is a very good provocation. It is a question that calls for about a 30-minute answer, which I cannot really do, but I will say a couple of things. In terms of Christian education, in terms of the training of clergy, for example, many of these ideas about the Spirit and about Pentecost need to be so central, not as required beliefs, but as understanding the very diverse ways the church works in the world. I have many friends who belong to the Eastern Orthodox churches, and so much of their Orthodox mainstream practice depends on a central idea of the Holy Spirit. This is not just a question of building bridges with Pentecostal churches, though that is important. It is also building bridges with Orthodoxy. You have many lessons that you know about the Spirit. Let's learn from you as well. The ethical, the political issues, as I say, we will be living in a bazaar, in a wild marketplace of ideas, and those ethical and political questions are so central. Here is maybe the most important thing. We live in a time when so many of our structures and institutions and frameworks are perhaps shaking, perhaps under threat. But there is no suggestion that the core, the center of that faith is in danger. Far from it. It is just expanding and evolving and developing new structures, and these are the things that we have to think about. It is reinforcing the center, the core, and not being totally focused on the institutions and the structures.
We will now collect a few questions, so please wait until we finish to collect the questions, and then you can answer all of them at the end. Do not answer every question individually, please. The European culture has Judean Christian roots. There are countries where already now, in part, but for sure in the years to come, this will be the case. That is, there will be more Catholics, more Christians than in the European countries. They do not have the same roots, obviously. So what does this mean? I believe that in those countries, just like we as Christians, moving from being the majority of the European population, we are now a minority. In those emerging countries, the new countries in Asia and in Africa, I still believe that Christianity is still a minority because the number of conversions grows, but also the number of the population grows. So this poses a great challenge for the church and for the Christians today. And I really liked what you mentioned about competition, which is vital. Competition among the monasteries in Asia, for example, one next to the other. It is better to have some competition rather than having one monopoly of religion in a state. Thank you so much for your remarks. I would like to ask you to clarify what you said before about the global church and the global theology. I didn't understood this very well. I wanted you, please, to clarify on this. And I have then another question. You talked about African churches placing healing at the center, the healing dimension, which can also help Western churches to rediscover their identity and their spiritual strength as Christians. So the problem I pose is this. The clergy, the priests, the seminarists in Africa either study in Europe or what they study in Africa is about Western philosophy, Western theology. Professor David said that the church was born at the root, at the basis of the cross in the Golgotha. In the West, we talk about enculturation. The Christianity that arrived in Europe was already enculturated, and Europe brought to Africa a Christianity that was not pure anymore. It was already enculturated. So this is an issue there. How can we communicate with the African church? That dimension of healing can be communicated. Now we have a lot of priests in Europe, in Italy, in France, performing this mission. So how is it possible to rediscover the identity of an African that has to help? This is the system now. These are young churches. They come here and they bring the gospel that we had received already. So how can we nurture that dimension of healing in these peoples that are about to lose their identity of Christians?
How many of those topics shall I try and address? Just the last one. Okay. So many questions, so many thoughts. In terms of Africa, I do not see identity being lost. I see identities changing. Identities always change. To come back to that idea of enculturation, there is no such thing as an original Christian culture. There is an original Christian truth which has many manifestations. I know an African scholar called Lamin Sanneh, who is one of the great scholars, and he makes a very important point. He says, the original language of Christianity is translation. It is not Greek. It is not Hebrew. It is translation. Christianity was born in the contact of cultures. It is not based, it does not have its home in any of those cultures. Those cultures will change over time. In 1,000 years, how do I know what cultures will be in 1,000 years? But I do know that Christianity will be in those different cultures. You know, this is not a perfect answer to a question, but if I can encourage you at some point, go and look at images of the Virgin Mary around the world. Go and see how every different culture uses every different cultural shade to represent the Virgin Mary according to a particular society. Does anyone believe there are 1,000 Virgin Marys? Of course not. There is one truth in different clothes and styles and images. Those cultures are not fixed. Christianity was born in change. It is born in translation, and that is its story. Our good fortune is that we can live in this world, observe this world, and observe an exciting age.
Direi che ringraziamo il
professore per la disponibilità. Well, we would like to thank Professor Jenkins for his availability and the profoundness of his answers. I do believe that we are much more aware of the fact that we are living in a very exciting era because of the complexity and the variety of the questions, and also the beauty of what the professor started describing is really incredible. Also, the questions that we had from the audience are real evidence of this. So it is interesting to go towards these challenges, asking ourselves, what is it that is giving life to all these novelties? What is the source of it? What is the origin of such a wealth of life taking different shapes and continuously changing in such a big way? So this is the real issue with which we can start facing ourselves and try and think about ourselves and try and understand what makes our reality much, much livelier and vibrant than what we think it is, such as the church. And this is a lively reality, as Professor Jenkins mentioned. So trying to find an answer to this question really gives us an answer to find the place of our life. This is a beginning of a path, and we do hope to have Professor Jenkins with us other times to understand how this is going to evolve. At 8:45, you can meet him at the book corner in the bookshop. He will be available to sign his books. So please give him again a warm applause to thank him on how he helped us understand better all these issues.